I'm the operations director for Aurrigo. We are a Coventry-based company, so like Microcab, we're based just up the road, and we're very pleased to be able to have our cutting-edge technology right outside this Tudor-style council house. It's quite an interesting juxtaposition this morning. I've got 9.5 minutes to tell you about what we've done in Coventry and where we've taken it, and a little bit about how we got there. Quite a lot of work in 9 minutes and 23 seconds. So when people talk about autonomous vehicles, one of the inevitable questions is, where will we see autonomous vehicles? And my answer is really in two areas: long distance and high speed, typified by a motorway or highway, and short distance and low speed, which is typified by city streets, science parks, and so on. But where, or what industry perhaps, is a better question, will autonomous vehicles make the biggest impact? And freight, I believe, is one of the biggest places where we'll see an impact, because freight vehicles typically do most of their driving in high speed, but very low complexity domains. So if you think about a typical motorway, you're sitting on the inside lane, hopefully most of the time, doing 62 miles an hour, hopefully most of the time, and you go from A to B. The complexity is, of course, that if you're delivering something to a city centre like in Cambridge, you can't easily do autonomy in that difficult place with a big vehicle. So I think the freight example is going to end up being like a river model example. So for example, the freight company has a building outside Milton Keynes on the M1, a consolidation centre. A lorry gets loaded up there. Autonomously, it moves from that freight centre to another consolidation centre, let's say outside Gateshead, Newcastle on the A1 there. And a pilot, an experienced driver, will then take that vehicle and do the drops in the city. So you end up with the people that are doing the driving are now employed to do the skilled bit, which is the bit that involves going around city streets. But the largely unskilled bit, which is maintaining a steady speed on the motorway, is done autonomously. I think that is where you'll see it in the near future. But for us, for Aurrigo, we think one of the great impact areas is in the first and last mile of a journey. So this is really about not taking intercity journeys, not going from the suburbs of Coventry into the centre. It's more about getting from the Coventry train station to the council house, for example. So the areas that I see the impact are city streets. So this is a pedestrianised area in central Newcastle. I used to live in Newcastle for 20 years, so I have a soft spot for it. It's typical of any kind of pedestrianised centre. It has lovely wide areas because it used to be a highway, but also it is far away from a city centre. It's far away, from the mass transit hub. So, for example, the train station is at the southern end of the town, and if you know Newcastle, that's kind of downhill, and everything else is uphill. Places like Bradford, Leeds in Yorkshire are also hilly. Coventry, less hilly, but still distances are a problem. Airports, this is Heathrow Airport. Fortunately, Newcastle Airport's not really big enough to give you an impact. But the point about airports is that the parking's on the outside and all the interesting stuff is on the inside, right? So if you want to get from the outside to the inside, you've got to get there. If you're an airport and you're paying for a bus, really it's an old bus, because why buy a new bus that our colleagues from National Express told me costs £250,000 when you could buy an X one with a couple of 100,000 more kilometres on it? It's not a very good passenger experience, and also if you're a passenger, you spend most of your time in a shelter in the rain waiting for the bus to come round. An autonomous vehicle provides a service from your car to the gate, but also between gates, for example. On the right-hand side is a shopping centre. This is the Gateshead Metro Centre. It's the same as any shopping centre. Parking is on the outside, the Gucci stuff is on the inside. If you are Gucci, you can afford the shop unit that's right next to the car park. If you're Jimmy's Joke Shop, then you're probably in the middle, right? Getting people to your door, driving traffic to your door, is more difficult. So how can we do that? Well, we could use autonomous vehicles, small vehicles that can run inside. And on the bottom is a science park. I can't remember where this is from, but science parks in places like Cambridge, Oxford, industrial areas, places like the NEC, for example, a campus area with hotels, a conference centre and a train station and an airport all in a particular place, all have the same challenges. You've got a lot of people trying to get to the same place at once, and how do you move them around once they're in there? Time check. Okay, we're doing well. The current transport mix. So in the first and last mile, there are already transport modes that will solve that problem. So you might say to me, well, Rick, I like your autonomous vehicles, they're awesome, but I could just get a taxi. Well, you can't get a taxi inside, clearly, but also taxis have a problem sometimes. If you've been queuing at the station for half an hour and somebody tells you that you just want to go 100 yards down the road, well, you're going to be very unlikely to want to accept that fare. Unless there's some kind of DDE requirement, you could very well refuse a fare. And anybody who's flagged down a London cabbie will know that they do that quite often. Now, buses are good, and light rail, so this is the Metro from the North East Metro, is a wonderful service. Light rail is great, but as we've heard, it costs a lot of money. Even very light rail is not going to be cheap to implement. And of course, once the infrastructure is there, it's there forever. So the Tyne-and-Wear Metro is actually based on the old railway system that was put in, from the 1840s onwards. Luckily, it survived the beaching cuts by being turned into the Metro system, so that was nice. Buses are good. Buses rely on roads, though, and also buses and trains also rely on fixed stops. So bus stops can move around a little bit, but generally speaking, if the stop is there, that's where it is, right? So if your office is 500 metres away from that bus stop or that tram stop, well, tough, you've got to walk 500 metres. And that leads me on to active transport, cycling and walking. Cycling requires equipment. Yes, you can hire this equipment, so bike hire schemes, the TfL bikes, and so on, they're prevalent. But you need to have a certain level of brevity, and I don't possess that in when it comes to road cycling. Active travel using your feet requires two things. Firstly, that you have at least 1 foot, because that's more helpful. And secondly, no matter how many feet you've got, they really ought to be properly connected to your brain, and that's not true for everybody. So active transport is not true for everybody. And if you have a disability problem, if you have a disability and you can't use some steps, and your local train station has steps and it doesn't have any way of mitigating those steps, then like on the underground, you have to travel to the next one and then move back. So it's not perfect. 2017, we started developing autonomous vehicles along with our partners in the UK Autodrive. Coventry City was one of those partners, as well as Milton Keynes. This is one of our early prototypes. But by 2019, we had completed several projects, and this is just a sample of some of the projects. We are now in South Australia, we are in Canada, we are in Singapore, we're in Scotland, which is quite far away. But more importantly, we're now looking at working with real customers. So this pod here, which is branded as Blind Veterans UK, is working at the Blind Veterans Hospital in Brighton, and that's a trial in conjunction with BV UK about moving people who have some form of sight loss, because that's the criteria to be a member, but also because people tend to be war wounded, they also have a whole range of other disabilities. And if you imagine that you're a 20-year-old person that used to ride motorbikes and downhill mountain bike, and you lost a leg in a recent conflict, then you are a pretty independent person that's suddenly got these challenges. And autonomy is a way of still having your private space. So if you're in your private car, you can do whatever you like in there when you're driving down the motorway. If you want to pick your nose and eat it, go ahead. You want to listen to terrible music, go ahead. But if you're in a taxi, you've got to be well behaved, right? So I think autonomy is a great way of providing that sense of freedom that you've got to do whatever the hell you please in your own private space. But keep it clean, because I need to be able to use it for the next person. So some of the projects that we've completed, this is a real sort of quick summary. We've been all over the place. Copenhagen, this is in, and as well as some of the other projects around the world. I'm afraid, because I feel I've waffled too much, I have to leave the video. We also worked on golf courses. Golf course is an interesting one. This golf course in Canada uses petrol-powered golf buggies, which are they're the dirtiest things I've ever seen. One drives past you, you're coughing for 5 minutes afterwards. So we've done a trial there about using these pods around the golf course to essentially move people from hole to hole, but without them having to actually have their own buggy. So you get off the hole, you do your golfing, whatever it is, and then you move into the buggy, into the pod, and move on to the next hole. But also, we're not about transporting people, so we do baggage. You may have seen the recent publicity. We did a project with Heathrow Airport and British Airways to move these bins around. Essentially, you put your bag down the chute, it gets packed into a bin, several of these bins go onto a plane. Currently it's a tug and 3, so you can see a tug behind and 3 of these. The problem is if you are filling only one of these dollies up with one bin, you've got 2 spare dollies. So they have a fleet of something like 7,000 dollies in Heathrow Terminal 5. If you automated them and got to close to 100% utilisation, you don't need so many dollies, right? You can cost save. So how did we get there? Right. We did some simulation work with Warwick. This is about taking the pod, putting it in a simulator, but actually using the pod in a loop. So when the wheels turn, the video turns. Fake GPS, fake LiDAR, really clever. Then we moved to indoor testing. This is our indoor test facility in Coventry in our UDL. This person here gets paid far too much money, but you see the job he has to do. So the idea is that once you've tested the software, once you've tested it in software, you can test it inside. Then once you've tested it inside, it's about testing it in a secure area. So this was moving to our secure test facility, which was in Milton Keynes. And finally, when you're happy that you've completed all that testing, it's about taking it on the street. So this is the culmination of our trials in Milton Keynes, and this was a bit of BBC filming, which I thought would make a nice little video. And that's me, slightly over. Thank you very much. Thanks.